The Airbus A220-300, the smallest wide-body replacement jet Airbus currently sells, has a published maximum range of 3,450 nautical miles. Convert that, and you get 6,389 kilometers. In 1938, a four-engine German landplane with a tailwheel and fabric-covered control surfaces flew Berlin to New York. The distance? 6,371 kilometers. The gap between a piston-era airliner and the published range of a modern jet was 18 kilometers. And within 2 years, the military had stolen this machine and turned it into something its designer never intended. Right now, if you pull up the Airbus website and look at the A220-300, the smallest wide-body replacement jet Airbus sells, you will find a published maximum range of 3,450 nautical miles. Convert that to kilometers, and you get 6,389. That is the distance a brand new, fly-by-wire, carbon fiber era airliner can cover in a single hop with a full fuel load. In August 1938, a four-engine German landplane with fabric-covered control surfaces and a tailwheel took off from Berlin, crossed the North Atlantic, and landed in New York. The distance it covered was 6,371 kilometers. The gap between that piston-era flight and the published ceiling of a modern A220-300 was 18 kilometers. Not 1,800. 18, less than 0.1%. The aircraft was the Focke-Wulf Fw 200 Condor. And the story of what happened to it after that landing is one of the most telling in 20th century aviation, because the machine that nearly matched a modern jet's reach was never designed for anything more violent than carrying 26 passengers in pressurized comfort across oceans that most airlines still thought belonged to flying boats. The man behind it was Kurt Tank, Focke-Wulf's chief designer and chief test pilot, which meant he was both the brain that drew the aircraft and the body that proved it could fly. Tank's proposal to Deutsche Lufthansa was not modest. In the mid-1930s, long-range prestige air travel was the domain of enormous flying boats. Short empires, Martin clippers, Dornier walls. They were romantic, heavy, and inefficient. Tank argued that a clean, four-engine landplane could do the same work faster, lighter, and cheaper. It was an engineer's argument dressed in an airline's economics, and Lufthansa listened. The prototype first flew on the 27th of July, 1937, with Tank himself at the controls. That detail matters. Tank was not simply signing drawings and watching someone else take the risk. He climbed into the left seat of an untested four-engine aircraft and took it into the air, because he believed in the aerodynamic logic he had put on paper. What followed was the proof of concept that would make the Condor famous. On the 10th of August, 1938, the aircraft, registration D-Acon, lifted off from Berlin-Staaken with Alfred Henke in command. Beside him sat Rudolf Freiherr von Moreau. Behind them, radio operator Paul Dierberg and flight engineer Walter Kober. 4 men, 4 engines, 1 Atlantic. They made New York in 24 hours, 56 minutes, and 12 seconds. The distance, 6,371.302 kilometers, was measured and recorded. It was the first nonstop Berlin to New York flight by a heavier-than-air landplane, and the number spoke for itself. This was not a stunt machine stripped to its ribs for a record attempt. It was a production-adjacent airframe with seats and a galley, doing exactly the job its designer said it could do, and that was before the military ever touched it. To understand what the Condor became, you first have to understand what it was built to be, and why its civil design logic was both its greatest strength and the seed of every wartime failure that followed. Tank designed the Fw 200 around range. That sounds obvious for a transatlantic aircraft, but range in a 1930s landplane meant very specific aerodynamic choices. A long, high aspect ratio wing to maximize lift to drag. A slim, lightly built fuselage to save weight. 4 BMW 132 radial engines, each displacing 27.72 liters, so the combined displacement of the entire power plant installation was roughly 110.88 liters of air-cooled radial machinery pulling a single elegant airframe across the sky. That is an extraordinary amount of reciprocating engine for one airplane, yet each BMW 132 was a relatively modest, reliable 9-cylinder radial. Tank was not chasing raw power. He was chasing efficiency at range. The airframe was also designed so that the Condor could remain airborne on just 2 of those 4 engines. That is not a throwaway marketing claim. For a 1930s passenger aircraft crossing open ocean with no diversion airports, 2-engine survivability was the line between a commercial proposition and a suicide note. Passengers, and more importantly, the insurance underwriters behind the airline, needed to know that losing an engine, or even 2, would not put the aircraft in the water. Tank built that margin into the wing and the power-to-weight arithmetic from the very start. The cabin itself sat 26 passengers, not in today's sense of 26 cramped economy seats, but in the 1930s long-haul sense. Wide seats, a smoking compartment, a galley, the kind of interior that treated transatlantic flight as an event rather than a commute. Deutsche Lufthansa wanted the Condor to compete with the glamour of Pan American's flying boat clippers, and the cabin was designed to make that argument in upholstery and walnut trim. All of this produced a machine that was genuinely advanced for its moment, but it also produced a machine that was genuinely fragile. A civil airframe optimized for long range and fuel efficiency does not carry the structural margins of a military aircraft. Its skin is thinner. Its spars are lighter. Its fuselage is shaped for passenger flow, not bomb bays. Every kilogram Tank saved by range was a kilogram of strength the Condor would later need and not have. That tension between brilliance and brittleness surfaced almost immediately, not in wartime, but on the Condor's second great prestige flight. In November 1938, just 3 months after the Atlantic triumph, Diakon was back in the air with Henke again in command. This time the crew included von Moreau, Dierberg, Kober, and an additional member, Georg Kohn. The destination was Tokyo. The purpose was part record attempt, part sales demonstration. Deutsche Lufthansa and Focke-Wulf wanted to show the Japanese airline market that the Condor could serve the longest routes in Asia as readily as it had served the Atlantic. The outbound flight succeeded. Berlin to Tokyo, with staging stops, demonstrated the aircraft's range credentials to the Japanese aviation establishment. But the return journey ended in the worst way an airline demonstration can end, short of killing someone. On approach to Manila, all 4 BMW 132 engines stopped. The cause has been discussed, but never conclusively pinned to a single system failure in surviving public records. What is certain is that Henke and his crew found themselves in a 4-engine glider over Manila Bay with no power and no runway within reach. Henke ditched. The aircraft, D-Akon, the same machine that had crossed the Atlantic, went into the water. Everyone aboard survived. That moment deserves more weight than most tellings give it. The very first Condor to prove the dream also hinted at how delicate the dream really was. D-Akon had flown the Atlantic and reached Tokyo, and now it was sitting on the floor of Manila Bay. The crew walked away, but the airframe, the one airframe that carried the entire Condor reputation, did not. If you are looking for a single scene that foreshadows everything the Condor would suffer in wartime, the Manila ditching is it. Range triumph followed immediately by operational fragility, and water closing over a beautiful machine. For a brief window, none of that mattered to the program's commercial prospects. Lufthansa ordered production Condors for its European and South American networks. A handful were exported: Brazil, Denmark, Japan. The aircraft was doing exactly what Tank designed it to do, flying long routes, carrying passengers, proving the landplane concept against the flying boat establishment. Then the world changed. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the peacetime airline network that justified the Condor's existence began to collapse. Deutsche Lufthansa did not vanish overnight. The airline continued to operate limited services during the war, particularly to neutral countries and across occupied Europe, but its fleet, its roots, and its institutional purpose were progressively absorbed into the war economy. Aircraft that had been designed to carry passengers and mail were repurposed, requisitioned, or simply grounded as fuel. Crews and maintenance capacity were redirected to the Luftwaffe. For the Condor, the transition was more dramatic than for most civil types, because the Condor had something the Luftwaffe desperately lacked: oceanic range. The German Air Force in 1939 was designed to support a continental army. Its bombers, Heinkels, Dornier, Junkers, were medium-range tactical machines built to hit targets a few hundred kilometers from the front line. The Luftwaffe had almost nothing that could fly sustained patrols over the North Atlantic, track a convoy for hours, report its position to the U-boat fleet, and, if the opportunity arose, attack a merchant ship at the limit of land-based air cover. The Condor could. That mismatch between the Condor's abilities and the Luftwaffe's needs is the hinge of the entire story. The aircraft was not selected for maritime warfare because it was well suited to it. It was selected because it was the only long-range airframe available in useful numbers, and the Atlantic War could not wait for a purpose-built replacement. The military conversion produced the FW-200C series. In broad terms, the transformation meant adding a ventral gondola for bomb aiming and a forward-firing weapon, fitting external bomb racks beneath the wings and fuselage, installing military radios and navigation equipment, replacing the passenger interior with crew stations and fuel tanks, and, critically, increasing the aircraft's operating weight far beyond anything Tank had designed the structure to carry. The engines changed too. Later, C models received Bramo 323R2 radials, rated at 1,200 horsepower each, replacing the original BMW 132s. That was a meaningful power increase, but it came with a corresponding increase in engine weight, propeller loads, and vibration, all fed into a fuselage and wing spar designed for a lighter, gentler civil aircraft. The Japanese connection is worth a brief aside here because it adds a layer most accounts skip. Japan had shown interest in the Condor as a civil transport, but there was also early exploration of the type for maritime patrol use in the Pacific, the same vast ocean, long-endurance logic that the Luftwaffe would pursue in the Atlantic. A small number of aircraft were delivered or earmarked for Japanese evaluation, though the program never matured into large-scale Tokichu Japanese Condor operations. What it shows is that the Condor's long-range appeal was not uniquely German. Any nation with an ocean to watch and no dedicated maritime patrol aircraft saw the same potential. The unit that would define the Condor's wartime reputation was Kampfgeschwader 40, KG-40, based at Bordeaux-Marignac in occupied France. From Bordeaux, the Atlantic was within reach. Condors could fly out over the Bay of Biscay, sweep north and west into the shipping lanes, and either attack targets of opportunity or shadow convoys and radio their position back to U-boat command. The circuit was enormous. A typical sortie might take the aircraft over 1,000 kilometers from base, hold it on station for hours, and bring it back on fuel margins that would have made a peacetime airline dispatcher nervous. KG-40's operations began in earnest in 1940, and the effect was immediate. Merchant ships that had previously sailed beyond the reach of German land-based air power were now being found, reported, and sometimes bombed by an aircraft they had never expected to see that far from shore. The convoy system, Britain's lifeline for food, fuel, and war material, suddenly had a new threat, and that threat was a converted airliner with a bomb rack. They had not designed a bomber, they had designed a long-range thoroughbred, and now they were hanging bombs under it. So if you're learning something today, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we cover the aircraft, the designers, and the decisions that changed aviation. Now, back to the Constitution, and the moment its ambitions hit the Pacific Ocean. By the winter of 1940, the Condor had become something its designer never intended, and the Allies had not prepared for: a long-range ship killer operating at the outer edge of convoy air cover. The numbers from that first devastating season are stark. By February 1941, Condors were credited with sinking approximately 363,000 tons of Allied shipping, That figure needs context. 363,000 tons is not a statistical abstraction. It is hundreds of merchant vessels, grain ships, tankers, munitions carriers, going to the bottom of the Atlantic, taking crews and cargo with them. Britain's survival depended on the convoy system, and the Condor was tearing holes in it from above while U-boats tore holes from below. Winston Churchill reportedly called the Condor the Scourge of the Atlantic. Whether the precise phrase originated in a memo, a meeting, or a post-war recollection, the label stuck because it captured something real. This single aircraft type, numbering never more than a few dozen operational machines at any time, was causing disruption out of all proportion to its fleet size. The most famous single action belonged to Oberleutnant Bernhard Jope. On the 26th of October 1940, Jope's Condor found and attacked the liner Empress of Britain, a 26,000-ton Canadian Pacific ship that had been requisitioned as a troop ship. Jope's bombs hit. The ship caught fire, was abandoned, and was later finished off by a U-boat torpedo while under tow. The sinking of Empress of Britain was the largest Allied ship lost to air attack in the Atlantic during the entire war, and it was done by a converted airliner. But the way the Condor attacked ships reveals how far the aircraft was from being a true bomber. The FW-200C carried only a crude bomb sight, nothing like the precision instruments fitted to dedicated heavy bombers. That meant accurate bombing from medium or high altitude was effectively impossible. Instead, Condor crews developed a low-level attack profile. Come in at mast height, bracket the target ship with a stick of bombs, and hope that at least one struck home. The standard long-range bomb load was often just 4 250-kilogram bombs, 1,000 kilograms total, delivered from sea level by an aircraft with the structural tolerance of an airliner. Think about that for a moment. A 4-engined aircraft the size of a modern regional jet, designed to carry passengers at altitude, was diving to wavetop height to drop a handful of bombs by eye. The courage required of the crews was extraordinary. The stress on the airframe was punishing, and the tactical limitations were real. 4 bombs at low level against a maneuvering ship in rough Atlantic conditions was not a high probability attack. The Condor's shipping toll owed as much to the sheer volume of undefended targets as it did to any particular lethality. The Condor's other wartime contribution, arguably more important than the direct sinkings, was reconnaissance. A Condor could find a convoy, shadow it for hours, and radio continuous position updates to U-boat command. That information allowed Donitz's submarines to form wolf packs around convoys that would otherwise have passed undetected. The Condor was the eyes of the U-boat war, and in that role, its long range was more valuable than its bomb rack. Fritz Flegel and the crews of IKG-40 were involved in the coordinated convoy battle around HG-53 in February 1941, one of the engagements where the Condor's dual role as bomber and scout was most visible. Aircraft found the convoy, attacked it, reported it, and guided U-boats onto it. The result was a brutal multi-day fight that demonstrated exactly why the Allies needed to solve the Condor problem. For all the fear it caused, the Condor was already living on borrowed structure. The Condor's wartime reputation peaked early and declined fast, and the reasons were as much mechanical as tactical. The most damning operational fact about the FW-200C was this: the aircraft had a persistent tendency to break its own back on landing. That is not a metaphor. The fuselage of the military Condor, loaded to weights far beyond the original civil design limits, developed a catastrophic failure mode in which the structure fractured just aft of the wing carry-through. At least 8 aircraft were lost to this single cause, not to enemy action, not to engine failure, but to the fuselage simply snapping under the stresses of a routine landing. The airframe that Kurt Tank had designed to carry 26 passengers in comfort could not absorb the punishment of operating at military weights with military stores hanging from its belly. Crews knew it. Operational reports from KG-40 recorded complaints that went well beyond the structural issue. The armament was considered inadequate, the defensive guns were too few, too poorly positioned, and too light to hold off a determined fighter attack. The fuel system was vulnerable. Hits to the wing tanks could produce leaks and fires that a military aircraft with self-sealing tanks might have survived. The Condor's fuel system was essentially a civil installation, because that is what it was. Self-sealing technology adds weight, and weight was the one thing tank's original design had ruthlessly minimized. All of these problems converged when the Allies began to close the mid-Atlantic air gap. The first and most immediate answer was the fighter. By mid-1941, RAF Coastal Command Hudsons were engaging Condors over convoys, and the results were one-sided. The Condor was large, slow, lightly armed, and structurally fragile. It could not sustain battle damage that a purpose-built military aircraft might shrug off, and its defensive armament could not keep a determined attacker at bay. One pilot in particular learned how to exploit the Condor's weaknesses with surgical precision. Royal Navy test pilot Eric Brown studied the aircraft's defensive layout and identified a blind spot in the forward firing arc. The Condor's defensive guns were positioned to cover approaches from the beam and rear, but a fighter coming head-on and slightly below could reach a zone where none of the defensive positions could bear. Brown used this knowledge to develop a head-on attack technique that gave the Condor crew almost no chance to respond. It was, in effect, an engineering exploit, a tactical hack made possible by the fact that the Condor's defensive scheme had been designed around a civil fuselage shape, not a bomber's optimized gun positions. The introduction of cam ships, merchant vessels fitted with a catapult, and a single expendable Hurricane fighter, just added another layer of danger. A cam ship could launch a Hurricane to intercept a shadowing Condor, and even though the fighter would have to ditch afterward, the trade was considered worthwhile. One Hurricane for the destruction or diversion of an aircraft that might otherwise vector an entire U-boat pack onto the convoy. Later, escort carriers brought permanent fighter cover to the convoys, and the Condor's ability to operate with impunity collapsed entirely. By mid-1941, the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded the point. Orders came down to KG-40 to avoid combat and preserve the remaining Condor fleet. That is a remarkable instruction. An aircraft that had been the terror of the Atlantic barely a year earlier was now too valuable to risk in the role it had been sent to perform. The fleet was too small. Total production would reach only 276 airframes, of which 263 went to the Luftwaffe. And the losses from combat, structural failure, and operational attrition were unsustainable. Every Condor lost was essentially irreplaceable because the production line was tiny and the airframe was not getting any stronger. The moment that captures the Condor's structural tragedy most intimately belongs to Lieutenant Werner Thieme. On the 22nd of February 1942, Thieme was piloting Condor Werknummer Scourge 063 on approach to land in Norway. During the landing sequence, the flap system malfunctioned. Only the port side flaps deployed. The starboard flaps remained retracted. The aerodynamic effect was immediate and violent. The aircraft pulled hard to the left, one wing generating far more drag and lift than the other, and the crew found themselves in a situation that no amount of control input could fully correct. Thieme later described what followed as a controlled crash. He put the aircraft into the Trondheim fjord, not a ditching born of engine failure or fuel exhaustion, but a forced water landing caused by the airframe's own systems failing at the worst possible moment. The crew survived. The aircraft sank. That phrase, controlled crash, is the epitaph of the Condor's military career. It was never a controlled military aircraft. It was a civil machine subjected to military demands, and every failure it suffered, the broken backs, the inadequate guns, the vulnerable fuel, the flap asymmetry that put Thieme in the fjord, traced back to the same root cause. The Condor was not built for this. The last Condor that survives into the present survives because it went into the water instead of trying to keep doing the job. After the orders to preserve fleet numbers, the Condor's role shifted. Some aircraft were reassigned to transport duties, including flights into the Stalingrad pocket in the winter of 1942-43, an operation that consumed transport aircraft at a horrific rate. The Condor was unsuited to that work too, but by then the Luftwaffe was using anything with range and cargo capacity, regardless of how well it fit the mission. The long-range maritime reconnaissance role, the job the Condor had performed best, if not safely, passed increasingly to the Junkers U-290. The U-290 was larger, stronger, and designed from the start with military structure and military equipment. It could carry radar, heavier defensive armament, and eventually guided missiles. It was, in every meaningful sense, the aircraft the Luftwaffe had needed all along, but had not had when the Atlantic War began. The Condor had filled the gap, and the gap had broken it. Production of the Fw-200 ended in early 1944. 276 built. A small number by the standards of any major wartime type, and a reminder that the Condor was never intended to be built in large numbers. Because the airline market, it was designed for measured demand in dozens, not thousands. After the war, the Condor vanished almost entirely. Most surviving airframes were scrapped, captured and tested, or simply left to rot on dispersal fields. The type that had crossed the Atlantic and terrorized convoys left behind almost no physical trace. Almost. Werknummer 0063, Werner Thiema's aircraft, the one that went into the Trondheim fjord in February 1942, sat on the bottom of the fjord for decades. Cold, deep, sheltered Norwegian water preserved what sunlight and oxygen would have destroyed. When the wreck was eventually recovered, it was the only substantially complete Fw-200 Condor remaining anywhere in the world. The reconstruction took approximately 2 decades. That figure alone tells you something about the complexity and obscurity of the project. This was not a well-documented, widely produced wartime type, with factory drawings neatly filed in a government archive. The Condor had been a niche civil aircraft turned niche military aircraft, and much of the original manufacturing documentation was missing. Restorers had to work from surviving fragments, photographs, incomplete technical manuals, and engineering intuition. Rebuilding the Condor meant rediscovering the Condor. Today, the restored aircraft is displayed at the Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin, fittingly at the site of the old Tempelhof Airport complex, where so much of pre-war German civil aviation operated. It sits there as the only complete example of its kind, a monument to a machine that was built to connect continents and was instead conscripted to sever them. There is a final irony in that survival, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Condor's entire wartime story is a story of structural fragility, of an airframe that could not bear the loads and the damage that war imposed on it, the backs that broke on landing, the fuselage that cracked aft of the wing, the flap system that failed and sent Thieme into the fjord. And yet, the single aircraft that endured into the 21st century endured precisely because it went into the water. The cold fjord preserved what war destroyed everywhere else. The Condor's weakness, its inability to keep flying when things went wrong, is the reason one example still exists. Kurt Tank designed an airliner to shrink the world. The world used it to strangle itself instead, and the only one left is the one that stopped flying earliest. Thank you for watching. If you found this one valuable, a like and a subscribe go a long way. We cover the aircraft and the stories behind them that most channels don't. And until next time, keep looking up.